Welcome back to the Afterword, a conversation about the future of words. We are so glad to have Greenville City Councilwoman Dorothy Dowe and Professor Emeritus at Calvin College, Dr. Lee Hardy, here with us to continue our conversation about the stories we tell around urban revitalization. Okay, Dorothy, what steps can local, state, and federal governments take to ensure that affordable housing exists in a redeveloped community?
I'm going to speak to the local step, if that's fair enough. That's my sphere of influence. The first thing is define what is affordable, right? So affordable, affordable means a different thing to everyone. What I can afford is different than, I mentioned my children before. What we can afford is very different. But affordable is very closely defined by the Housing and Urban Development Department. So it's based on area median income. And there are formulas in there, but just making that definition known to community members, I think is important, because in my opinion, in Greenville, we have tossed around the term affordable housing loosely. The nice thing is now that we're really sinking in and getting, traction on helping the situation that's been created, we're working on, making people aware of what does that mean, affordable housing? What do we mean by that? There are two. I mentioned in the other episode that we don't have inclusionary zoning. We can't. It is a state law. So, maybe there's something our state legislators can look at in that area. But as far as at the local level, we use the tools that we have in our toolbox. So one thing that the city has done generously, we can do better. Certainly, but we have funded the Greenville Housing Fund. In other words, our vehicle for getting funding to affordable housing is through the Greenville Housing Trust Fund. Okay, that's a 501c3. We deferred in this year's budget. We gave $2 million. Our goal is to give, my goal, and I think the rest of council's, is to give $5.5 million over the next 5 years. We're about to go into year 3. And the other tool that we have is to give land towards affordable housing. So, the biggest example of that I can give is the land that's surrounding Unity Park that the city owns is going to be given to the Greenville Housing Fund for development of affordable housing. We also can give tax incentives. We can give fees in lieu of. We can give incentives like that, as well as density bonuses that we talked about the last time to developers to incentivize affordable housing. I really feel like we're doing good in this area because we have more and more developers wanting to get into the affordable housing development business. So if it wasn't a good business to be in, I think we'd see a shortage of them, but we're seeing more and more. The thing to keep in mind is that affordable housing developments operate on I use the Big Mac analogy. The funding for affordable housing projects is made up of many, many layers, complex. I'm sure Dr. Hardy could speak to them, even in more detail than me. But it's like piecing together a funding puzzle. It's not like buying a house where you go to a bank, you apply for a loan. They're probably going to want your tax return. They're going to want to know what you make. They're going to want to know your assets, and they're going to decide if they loan. Affordable housing projects are put together with multiple streams. Money might be coming from the federal government. Money might be coming from the Greenville Housing Fund. Land might be coming from the Greenville Housing Fund that was given from the city. All of these things are aligning the stars to make the project to go, and they operate on such thin margins that it takes time to put them together.
Mm-hmm. Well, that goes back to Lee's comment about our essential answer is complexity. I'm like, wow, I am feeling this is huge.
It is, especially in the area of affordable housing. So I've been involved in some of those projects, and one of the chief sources of funding are the LIHTC funds, the low-income housing tax credits. That's federal money that's administered by the states. And basically, developers interested in affordable housing can apply for these tax credits up to 2/3 of the development. And if they're awarded that, then they can take these tax credits let's say like a reduction, tax credit of 9% over 10 years, and they can sell that like to a corporation. So you'll get a tax credit worth $900,000 over 10 years, and we can sell that to you for some, negotiated price. So we get the money, and you get some tax credit. But those are really hard. They're very competitive. And the project I was working on, the applications were taken every 6 months. It took us 4 rounds to get that. And every application was about a foot high of paperwork. And it's a very detailed scoring system that changes from one application period to another. And so, but persistence paid off. But, that was part of the funding. Then the other funding came from HUD, because the tax reform that was done on the federal level during the Trump administration reduced corporate tax rates, which made the LIHTCs less valuable, right? So if your corporate taxes are lower, your tax credits aren't going to be worth as much. So we lost about 20 cents on the dollar with that federal tax cut. So we had to search for money in another source.
Holland, I also want to make sure, at least for Greenville, that we recognize it's not always just government that's playing in this sphere. So I love this example of something one of our local, very prominent restaurateurs did. We talked about a lot of our workforce downtown. So our downtown has a lot of places, Lee, to eat and to shop and to stay overnight that are lovely, and they rely on workers to keep the engines running. One of our local restaurateurs was, I assume still is, providing salary incentives to live downtown. In other words, he is rewarding his wait staff with a certain amount, and he has, a limit to this, but a certain amount of money in their check to allow them to live downtown or to park downtown, which, by the way, isn't free either. So, here is a private business incentivizing to get his wait staff. Now, we have turned in the last 5 years, in my opinion, we have turned a really important corner in Greenville, in that the majority of people in the city, I believe, have come to recognize the value in providing affordable housing and how much we rely on people across a full spectrum of income levels. So let's say it's someone that really enjoys eating, that has no financial pressures themselves, but they really enjoy eating out downtown. Well, for them to be able to get that meal in a reasonable amount of time, and for that meal to taste just right, they're going to rely on someone and a group of someone's that probably can't afford to live in that area. Highly likely they can't afford to live near that restaurant. So in the absence of providing them either access to transportation or access to housing, you're not going to get that meal in 15 minutes or whatever your expectation is for it. Also, I don't want to overlook those that might not be in the realm of what has been portrayed as low income, but just our workforce. Those that fall into the workforce housing spectrum. This is another area to define, but basically our teachers, our cops, our first responders. So a teacher starts out now, I guess, around $40,000. They got a big salary, not a big, it was well-deserved, and it was minimal when you think about how little they'd gotten over the years. And then Greenville County does a bonus on top of that. But let's say teachers and cops are starting at around $43,000 a year. Especially if you're feeding a family, that is not going to let you live in the city. Right. And who does not want to have teachers and cops living near them, So the point I'm making is that Greenville as a community, I think, has turned a dramatic corner in the community wants to prioritize affordable housing, access to affordable housing. And that is something that has given us the legs to make it a major priority.
I really love that. So you kind of segued right into our next thought is, what is the role of other stakeholders, such as nonprofits, construction companies, restaurateurs, And, Lee talked about faith communities in part of his grant. How do they help play a role in this redevelopment of profitable, sustainable, and effective communities? Lee, I'll let you go first.
Well, I guess I'll start close to home with my own church. So I go to a church that most people would say is inner city location in a distressed neighborhood. For some 30 or 40 years, the properties right across the street have been vacant lots and vacant and vandalized buildings. And about, 12 years ago, I got tired of looking at those things and lamenting the fact that they weren't performing for the neighborhood. They weren't doing us anyone any good. So with some fellow parishioners, we got together. We formed an LLC, a limited liability company, which are very easy to form. And we pooled private capital together, and our mission was to acquire the 5 lots across the street from the church. They're individually owned. And we wanted to do that within 5 years. And if you know anything about, urban development, that's kind of a crazy goal, to aggregate 5 individually owned properties that are contiguous. But we were successful. In 6 years, we had them all. The recession of 2008 helped us when some property owners went bankrupt. And the goal was to provide what they call patient capital. That's just money that's not anxious to make a profit. We can wait, and do this. We're not trying to make a big profit. We're just trying to break even. And our goal was to acquire those properties, assemble them, and then hand them off to an enlightened developer for affordable housing. And we were able to do that in partnership with a local faith-based nonprofit housing organization. And now we have, as of 1 year ago, we have 2 4-story buildings providing 65 affordable units. And then on the ground level, we have 6 live-work units. So these are ones that have a retail front and then an apartment in back. So you kind of rent the whole unit, and you can run your office or your shop in front and then live in the back. And all of those are affordable. So the rents are set. Dorothy mentioned AMI. So you have a area median income, and then you can set affordable housing at either 80% or 50% or 30% are the usual percentages. And the idea is to set prices at those levels so that households of lower income can rent those and not spend more than 30% of their household income. 30% of household is kind of the rule of thumb for affordability. So there's the story of a private initiative. And we've seen a lot more like that in our own town. I'll just mention one more in my travels on that grant. And that was the tiny home village in Detroit. So this is run by the Methodist Church, Cass Community Social Services. And in Northwest Detroit, they acquired 16, a lot of vacant lots in Detroit, so it's not hard to acquire those. They got 16 vacant lots, and they are building tiny homes on them. So their homes about 450 square feet. And they're taking people from homeless shelters and off the street, and they run a rent-to-own program. So if you're taken into the program, you rent the tiny home for $1 per square foot, so it might be $450 a month. They can provide employment. And if you rent consistently for 7 years, then they hand you the title. You own the place. And this is another affordable housing initiative that's dealing with the most vulnerable populations, run by a private, concern. Now, a lot of the funding for the construction of those tiny homes comes from local churches. They'll adopt one, raise the funds, furnish it, paid off for the organization, and then rent it to the individual.
I think that's what we love the most, Holland, is hearing these stories that connect the topic, because, you know, a lot of people are going to go to sleep when they start hearing figures of bed and all sorts of things. But when you hear the story behind that, when you hear the story of that revitalization, that's what hits the heart. And Dorothy, I see you nodding your head. So chime in, Dorothy, what's your story?
Well, you know, it's wonderful to hear Lee say these things, and through my mind, I think, yep, we got that going on. We got that going on. So it's, you know, I'm not imagining this. We are on the cusp in Greenville of really making progress in this. You know, my frustration is the wheels of government move really slowly. I come from the private sector, and I'm like, my gosh, it takes a long time. Yeah. But we have several. So you asked, you know, what is the role of these other
stakeholders
in our community? And I think the role is as much as they want and can do, because if government was the only solution to this, we're going to end up right to where we were before, where Lee mentioned, you know, he described where we build the projects and we take people who, you know, are getting a housing voucher. We dump everyone into one community out on an island and say, good luck. Hope it works for you. And the great example of that is, if you've heard of Lefrak City in Queens, New York, a classic, just build these high rises, put 100% low income families in there, don't give them any tools to pull up their bootstraps, no transportation, no access to jobs, you know, and you expect them to, you know, be successful in that. And what you did was you set them up for more, you know, more failure. Yeah. So, we're turning a corner on that, thank goodness. And in Greenville, we do have several faith-based communities. One that comes to mind, I think a front runner in terms of providing affordable rental housing is Allen Temple. Temple AME Church has really been a front runner on this, and Reverend Speed, who is the head of that congregation, made a point to me, and this is one that this might be a whole nother podcast, but the issue of affordable rental versus affordable home ownership. Not everyone wants to own a home. Not everyone is capable of owning a home. So you think of maybe a senior citizen who cannot mow their grass, who cannot keep up a house. You know, this is what senior citizen, you know, the gracious retirement living was built on, that not everybody wants to be taking care of a home or can take care of a home. Rentals are needed and are important. So Allen Temple has a mission and is moving forward and has been for some time in partnering to build affordable rental housing. Some of their, you know, and it might be a rental home, you know, it might be a single family home, but it is a rental and it's, you know, priced affordably. Another one, St. Anthony's has been a huge advocate for affordable housing. Father Tuttle, of course, and he's not there anymore, but even members of that congregation have gathered together and purchased land and partnered, similar to what Lee described, to build affordable homes. Our nonprofits are critical. I think of Homes of Hope. Don Oglesby with Homes of Hope has been in you know, doing his work for a long time. And if you're familiar with the Haney Serene area, there is a beautiful neighborhood of affordable homes that Don Oglesby built. Also in West Greenville, he's got a large amount of rental property there that are affordable, and just has really been remarkably successful. Habitat for Humanity, don't forget them. Yeah. You know, I mean, they've got a great model. Habitat for Humanity has been greatly impacted, by the way, you know, through COVID. When you think about now, they can't, you know, they had the volunteer base, but they can't bring them together in COVID. So what do? There are even traditional builders that have built unaffordable homes, or not, you know, that wasn't in their portfolio, that are entering into building projects. Again, there's a community being built called Sumler Hall in Nicholtown right now. In fact, after this, I'm going to a forum that's talking about that. Sumler Hall is in Nicholtown, you know, a very historic community, predominantly Black, affordable housing, very much needed in that community. And these are 39 homes, 8 of which will be priced affordable. So, there's a lot going on it in different areas of the community coming from different stakeholders. And I see that growing.
That's wonderful.
But it's as complex as it is, these builders, these developers, there's a learning curve for them. So for everyone that gets into the business of it, there is a steep learning curve. Mm-hmm. It's extremely steep for me. I'm sure it's steep for them. And a lot of it is in the timing and the financing of it and the people pipeline. How do we get people into these? Right?
Yeah. I mean, Lee describes the paperwork of some of these things being, a foot deep. And so, that makes it tricky. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I love the stories.
The worst thing we can do, well, there are a lot of worse things we can do, but a really bad thing we can do is setting someone up for failure. If you put someone into an affordable house that they won't be able to manage, you've set them up for failure. So for example, Habitat has a pretty stringent program you've got to get through to qualify for that house. And I see that as a good thing. Homeownership is not easy.
We had our episode when we talked with Jerry Blassingame and Soteria. I mean, they do a beautiful model on teaching the fundamentals mm-hmm. of life when you are re-entering after being incarcerated. So
listen, not to knock the school system, but I can tell you our high schoolers have no idea. I mean, they are clueless on financial management because we're not teaching it to them.
Yeah, that was Jerry. Jerry made that point very, very clear.
Yeah. Love Jerry. I'm so glad you've had him on.
Yeah.
Well, just a couple more questions here. Lee, what can we do to help sustain diverse neighborhoods while also rebuilding, restoring, and renewing these depressed public places?
Well, these questions are related in good ways that they reinforce each other. So my view is that we could look at zoning changes, again, to allow for a mix of housing types within specific areas and not segregate areas of, exclusively single-family detached on 1-acre lots or big multi-unit apartment buildings, but to allow for intermediate types, missing middle housing, so that we, in this way, make neighborhoods more inclusive rather than exclusive. Yeah, I guess I just learned that you can't have inclusionary zoning, but you can change zoning to allow for different residential typologies, different types of homes. That would be affordable to a greater band of income levels. And also stage of life issues, right? If you're a college student or raising a family or empty nesters, can you find a place within the neighborhood? Or do you have to keep moving to different, far distant locations? Exclusionary zoning, where we don't allow apartments or rentals in single family detached neighborhoods has a kind of dark history, actually. It goes back to Baltimore in 1910, where the city made a law that it was made it against the law for an owner of a house on a white majority block to sell it to a Black family. You could not you would be breaking the law if you sold your house to a Black family if you live in a white majority block. There was a similar law like that in St. Louis, and then that was contested and it was struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1917. And the city planners in St. Louis said, well, okay, we can't discriminate here, or we can't really impinge on the freedom of contract, right? So if you own a home, you should be able to sell it to whomever you like. So they went back to the drawing board and they said, I think we know how to accomplish our goal here. We can exclude rental property from single-family detached neighborhoods. And since most of our Black African American households are renters, we can, exclude them just with a reference to housing type. So that was legal. But at the time, the planning director for St. Louis, his name was Harlan Bartholomew, admitted that exclusionary zoning ordinance was designed to keep colored people out of our finer residential districts. Those were his words.
Yeah.
So, this idea of separating people by class and then by race has, a history that I think we need to look at. Yeah. And maybe recommit ourselves to inclusive communities rather than exclusive.
Well, thank you. Well said. I think, Dorothy, you were mentioning that a little bit earlier on our other podcast about, knowing better and doing better. And so let's think about the regional histories of places like Greenville or Greenwich Village or wherever. And how does that history shape the racial and economic makeup of a community? And how does it affect gentrification?
I think the first thing is the history kept and valued and recognized, call it what it is. So Lee mentioned, the laws that precluded properties being transferred to a Black buyer. That certainly was going on here. Certainly in areas of Greenville, deeds were such that the property could not be sold to anyone other than a white person, right? In a great example also of a history of exclusion is Cleveland Park. Cleveland Park, surrounded by some of the richest neighborhoods in Greenville, as well as some of the poorest. So its boundaries are essentially Alta Vista, Cleveland Forest, Nicholtown, Ridgeland. Blacks used to be excluded from even being in Cleveland Park. I'm digressing from the question, I know, but I think the first thing is to recognize that history existed, and it's not completely gone. So to be clear, it's not completely gone. So we've got to be real honest about that. In terms of developing and valuing diversity in housing, it's not just a checkbox. It starts with just that, valuing a diverse community and not saying, yeah, we've got this, X percentage, this or that, but focusing on the outcomes. Why is a diverse community is good? Why should we be inclusive? And I believe that we can do better. I believe that it's very valuable, and I think it's essential to our strength as a community going forward. I don't know if that completely addressed your question.
I think it did. Well said. Well said. I agree completely. And, again, when you look at that history and, many of us may not remember an exclusionary code of 1910.
Redlining,
Yeah, redlining. I was thinking the same thing, Dorothy. But we are now beneficiaries of that tradition and those things that have happened in the past. So bringing them to the surface and being aware of them is so important. So I appreciate
I will tell you, one of the most valuable experiences I had as a candidate was, so Nicholtown's just a really, very historic community, has been changed greatly over time. Has been was ignored infrastructure-wise for a long time. And I have a friend, colleague, I'm not sure how to describe him, but was familiar with Nicholtown. And I said, show me Nicholtown through your eyes. And driving it is not, you're never going to learn a community by driving it. If you can walk it or ride it or whatever, do that. And so I thought we'd go running through it. I'm a runner. I thought we'll run through it, we'll learn it. And he's a cycling guy. So we rode our bikes, him better than I. But he had spent a lot of his childhood there and remembered the things that were important, the people that were important, so he's sort of let's say around 30 now, but he spent a lot of time growing up in Nicholtown before the gentrification was, really becoming striking. and what was important about that time that he valued so much and wanted to see come back. And I get it. Those things you recall, that what was strong, as an area is getting gentrified, that, they're not even on anyone's radar anymore. And they were so critical to that community. We didn't even talk about this, and it's a whole nother, again, that's another podcast, but certainly in areas that are becoming gentrified, a priority should be on keeping people in their home who want to stay in their home. So I mentioned earlier, not everybody wants to have a home, but for those who have been in a community, for generations, we need to do whatever we can to be sure that they stay in their home and that they know what will happen to their home when they are gone, and that whatever's going to happen to their home is what they would want. And that comes through education and support, however we can give it.
If I could add to that, one of the benefits of gentrification is the rise in home values and equity. So if you have an existing homeowner in a gentrifying neighborhood, the value of that home is going up. Their household wealth is going up. Their equity, they're building equity, which I think is a good thing. The problem is often with rising property taxes as a result of that. And, states can deal with that in different ways. In Michigan, we have the Headley Amendment, which basically limits the increase of property taxes year to year to the rate of inflation. In California, it's Proposition 13 that limits annual raise in property taxes by 1%, which probably wasn't a good idea. So they passed that in 1978, and then the state went bankrupt, But also property tax deferment. So the idea is that the increase in property taxes doesn't come due until you sell the house, and you can pay that out of the equity. So you can hang on to your house, you can build equity, and you're not going to be forced to move because you can't afford the property taxes anymore.
Wow.
So Amy, I saw you clapping your hands while he talked about property taxes, and we have sort of a problem. There is a lot of talk in Greenville about people being displaced because their property taxes got too high for them to afford. Mm-hmm. And that may be true, but I want us to really understand, and we've just gotten through doing a forum in Nicholtown for threats to housing security. So our state law caps the amount that we can raise the taxable value of a house. So as a state, every 5 years in our county, we reappraise the value of a house. So when you get your property tax bill, you'll see a number that says the value of your house and then the taxable value of your house. That taxable value of your house can only be increased. I hope I get this right because we just went through it. I believe 15% in that 5-year reassessment. So let's say you have let's say you have a $150,000 house, to use easy numbers, but the taxable value is set at $100,000. The market value is $150,000, the taxable value is set at $100,000. At the 5-year increment, the most they could raise the taxable value to would be $115,000. Mm-hmm. And then the millage on that and the tax rate, goes from there. Now, that is not true of fees. So any, fees that are on top of your property tax, those have a lot more liberty to change. But we're very sensitive to that within the city. What's a real tragedy is when a homeowner doesn't understand their property tax bill or doesn't scrutinize it. For example, anytime the title is changed, if they had the homestead exemption, that homestead exemption goes off. So, let's say you're single and then you change it to joint ownership, joint with rights of survivorship, whatever, that homestead exemption goes away and you have to reapply for it. Just a matter of paperwork. But if you didn't know that, your tax bill is going to go up significantly. So we as a city are trying to work with the communities to make sure everybody who wants to know about their tax bill, fascinating, I know. I mean, they were just pounding down the doors on this forum. It's really important. It's the tax season now. it's really important that people take responsibility to understand their tax bill, because I'm not sure it's really true in Greenville that all of a sudden a property tax bill explodes, and that's what displaced them. More likely is somebody knocked on their door and said, I'll give you $40,000 for your house. And that was more money than they had ever seen, and they sold it and quickly learned that $40,000 won't buy you a house anywhere near Greenville.
Yeah.
Yep.
Move to.
Yep. Wow. People are important. That's what I'm hearing, Holland, in this episode, is that people are important. It's not necessarily about the housing. It's the people behind the stories of the house.
So we normally conclude with a metaphor, and Dorothy gave us a great metaphor earlier when she said urban revitalization is like a Big Mac. So that was...
I think I said the financing of affordable housing is like a Big Mac.
The financing of affordable housing is like a Big Mac. So,
and hey, that would be a simile, not a metaphor, right?
It would be.
Isn't it? As it's a simile.
It would be. But when we have asked this question, we have gotten all kinds of different answers, and most of the time they're not metaphors. But when we ask the question, people will give you a word picture, whether it's a Big Mac or something else. So we say metaphor and we take what we get. But do both of you have a really quick metaphor? We can stick with the Big Mac if we want. Do you have a really quick metaphor to share with us about how this would help us understand the stories of urban revitalization? And then we're going to wrap it up.
Well, I guess I'll try one. So I think I compare the process of urban revitalization to tending to a garden that's not at present flourishing. You have to take in all the relevant factors, right? The soil, the amount of sunlight and moisture, the hardiness zone. You have to have some sense of design, your ground cover and your mid-level flowers and plants, your understory trees, your canopy trees. And then you go to what some landscape designers call editing. They kind of edit the landscape. They're taking out certain plants and adding in other ones to get the right mix so that you wind up with a garden that is flourishing and where the plants are mutually reinforcing each other and becomes, to some degree self-sustaining. I think that's, an apt metaphor for urban revitalization and its goal.
Beautiful. I'm going to live in that garden.
Dorothy, do you have another one?
Okay, I'll give you one. I don't know. I hope this fits. So Lee's was wonderful. So those are hard. That's a hard one to follow. But so my mother was a wonderful cook. And a lot of the recipes she used were handwritten on notebook paper, like 3-ring bind, the wide margin. And there was these are all kind of stuck in this old, dilapidated New York Times cookbook that's falling apart. The bindings broke. It can't be, it's not useful anymore. It's faded. But yet there are many things, loose leaf paper stuck in there with different recipes. So I think the with urban revitalization in this metaphor, the first thing is to value what's in its core that's important and worth valuing and saving. What gives that New York Times cookbook with loose leaf paper stuck in it? What's the vision? What's the memory of my mother cooking, how it tasted. And then there's some things that just weren't good, right? So my mother and father loved liver. I don't fault them for that. And my mother loved beets. I like beets now, but back then I did not like beets. And so there are these recipes that maybe were great then, and they loved, but now is a new time. So what can I take from that cookbook? Because I want to save it. I know it has value. And then there are some things that just aren't applicable anymore because, now I've got a new family, to feed, and maybe they don't like liver. So there's a better way of getting our iron. Mm-hmm. And so maybe I don't need to save those, but I better be scanning in those memories from that old one, shoring it up Those loose leaf papers, they're not going to last. Get them digital. Get them so they can last and value what they bring to the table and preserve them going forward. Does that fit the assignment? Is that okay? Because I'm not a literature person.
I think Holland, we can give both Lee and Dorothy A's for metaphors tonight.
I'll take a P. I'm all about the pass fail. P is fun.
Okay. Well done. Well
Those
done.
are some of the best metaphors, and this has been a fantastic conversation. I mean, I learned something every time we do every time we record an episode. But my goodness,
It's delightful. Lee, have you been to Greenville?
No, I studied a map.
Yeah.
And I thought, you've got some nice blocks downtown. They're about 200 feet by 400 feet. That's a very good grid. And then I thought you could probably do a tour of development by taking Highway 81 out southwest to Whitehorse and Powdersville. You could see this progression of urban settlement, suburban, and then what I would call exurban development, where you have these arterials and cul-de-sac, arrangements. Just do a little travel through time, driving on the highway.
We didn't even get to talk about urban sprawl. Speaking of Whitehorse Road.
Yeah, That's, as you have said several times, Dorothy, this is going to have to be another podcast.
oh my!
Whitehorse, but come on.
No.
Okay, very quickly, Dorothy, where can folks connect with you and learn more about your work or about Greenville Revitalization?
All right, I'll give you two ways. To connect with me, you can connect on social media, and I fully respect people who hate social media. So I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter as Dowe Dorothy. Not Dorothy Dowe. Dorothy Dowe is my personal stuff. You'll not find anything interesting there, but Dowe Dorothy, DOWEDOROTHY is what my handle is, for lack of a better term, on Facebook, Insta, and Twitter. On there, you'll see a link in my bio to a newsletter that I put out quarterly. So the way I do you get it, Amy? Are you on my list? Good. Holland, you need to get on my list. That is the way I communicate the work that we as a council are doing, the impactful votes that we're taking, things that are on the horizon that I want constituents to be aware of, particularly when there's public comment is welcome. We want to hear from them. So that newsletter is really critical. If you are not a social media person, I fully respect you. I love that. I remember my life before social media, and it was wonderful. A good place you can start is the City of Greenville website. Each council member is there and our contact information is there. And all I ask when people contact me, if I don't know them, is don't just text me, pick up the phone and call me or email me. I'm fine. All my information is there, and I love to hear from people. And if I don't know the answer, I can do everything I can to get you an answer.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much. Lee, if people want to get in touch with you and learn more about your books and what you're doing.
So I'm not a social media person, not because I hate it, but because I was born in 1950. I'll plug my book. It's called The Embrace of Buildings, a second look at walkable city neighborhoods. I like it. I think it's pretty good. It contains a lot of the content that went into my course on urban design and the cultural history of American cities. And then I don't have a website either, but I do have a personal website, but I have a website that I developed that have the results of that study I did on faith communities and affordable housing. I don't know, do you post links on your website or not? Yes. You do?
Yep. If you will both send us your information, we will tie this into our show notes. Yeah,
so I'll send the link there. But there's a lot of examples of a lot of creative work that's being done by, private entities like churches to advance affordable housing. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much. So to everyone else, please join us next week for a discussion on motivation. We'll be talking about what words and stories can encourage children and adults to do what they don't want to do.
That's right. And as you wait, we ask that you will please leave us a review, rate us on Apple Podcasts, and become a subscriber to the afterwordpodcast.com. It does help us keep the conversations going. You can also find us on Google Podcasts. And as always, remember, you are welcome at our table.